Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of 3 election postmortem panels organized by the Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. My name is Eric Schickler, and I'm a professor of political science and co-director of IGS, along with Professor Christina Mora in sociology. Thank you for being with us here today. Now, while much of the attention since November 3rd has been on the presidential election, there were a number of other critically important decisions before the voters in California, including a series of controversial ballot propositions. While Joe Biden earned an overwhelming victory in the state of California, these ballot propositions, as well as some of the congressional and state legislative races, included significant defeats for progressives. What does all this mean for the future of California, and in particular for the cause of social justice and equity in this state? To help answer these questions, we've invited some of the state's leading voices on politics to join us today. Elected in 2014, State Comptroller Betty Yee serves as the state's chief fiscal officer. She also chairs the Franchise Tax Board and serves as a member of the CalPERS and Cal State Teachers Retirement System boards. She has over 30 years of experience in public service, specializing in state and local finance and tax policy. A native of San Francisco, Comptroller Yee received her bachelor's degree in sociology right here from the University of California, Berkeley, and she holds a master's degree in public administration. Thank you, Comptroller Yee, for joining us. John A. Pérez, Speaker Emeritus of the California Assembly, was appointed to the University of California Board of Regents in November 2014 by Governor Brown. In May 2019, Speaker Pérez's colleagues on the board elected him to serve as chair. The speaker's commitment to higher education goes back to his days as a student and activist here at UC Berkeley and carried forward into his service in the California legislature. Speaker Pérez is the author of landmark legislation, creating California's middle-class scholarship and first in the nation health benefits exchange under the Affordable Care Act. Thank you, Speaker Pérez, for joining us.
For having me.
Ben Christopher is a political reporter for Cal Matters, where he covers California politics and elections. Prior to that, he was a contributing writer for Cal Matters, reporting on the state's economy and budget. Based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, he has written for the San Francisco Magazine, California Magazine, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Ben is also a Berkeley alum. He has a master's in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy here at Berkeley. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
And then finally, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Marisa Lagos. Marisa reports on state politics for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk. She also appears weekly on a podcast analyzing the political news in the state. Before joining KQED, Marisa worked for the San Francisco Examiner, LA Times, and San Francisco Chronicle. In 2011, she won a special award for her extensive, excellent work covering California justice issues from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. And she also helped lead the Chronicle's award-winning breaking news coverage of the 2010 San Bruno PG&E explosion. Thank you so much, Marisa, for moderating, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm really excited to be here. And I just excited to get the thoughts of this panel because there's so much to kind of wade through when you look at this election. As Californians, we are constantly asked to weigh in on so many things, so many sort of disparate things that we're all expected to become experts on as voters. So I want to start with a kind of broad question. And Ben, I'll go to you first since you're our neutral reporter, and then we can hear from our politicos. But you know, Joe Biden won the state by 30 points. And in so many ways, California is reliably blue. But if you look at the ballot measures, it's really a mixed bag, right? We have voters very narrowly rejecting Prop 15, the commercial property tax measure, which would have raised billions for schools and government programs. We see an embrace of Prop 22, which we saw, unprecedented spending by these gig companies to exempt drivers from employee laws. We upheld cash bail, but rejected rollbacks to criminal justice reform, gave felons the right to vote. I could go on, there's 12 of them, but I won't. Some people are kind of framing this like California is not as progressive as we thought. Is that your takeaway, Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's one that I've been asking myself for the last week or however long it's been since the election. I'm completely losing track of time. But I mean, this is one of those elections I think is quite difficult and frustrating for political reporters because it's so much easier when voters provide results that are totally ideologically consistent and we can look at them and say, okay, aha, this is what the voters think, this is the take that I'm going to write. But as you said, it is really a mixed bag. I think, in terms of looking at the proposition results themselves, I think one explanation is sure that the electorate is not as progressive as perhaps some of the political leaders in the state, certainly not as progressive as the stereotype of the state that is provided by the president, talking about California as this sort of far left bastion of these sort of nutty, crazy lefty ideas. And obviously California has always been much more complex politically than that stereotype. And you mentioned, voting down affirmative action, not expanding rent control, the sort of the big loss from organized labor when it comes to Prop 22 and the sort of the gig economy. And so I think partly it could be an ideological dimension or sort of a reflection of the ideology of sort of a more moderate ideology of the state. But also if you look at propositions historically do tend to fail. That's sort of the sort of cliche, I think, in California politics is that if voters are confronted with an issue, particularly a very complex issue, and as you noted, there are a lot of really complex issues. I feel like we all should be experts on kidney dialysis regulation at this point because now we voted on it twice. But anyhow, I think the cliche is that when voters are confronted with something that's a little bit hard to parse, they will default to no. Just sort of at first, first do no harm kind of principle. If you're not really sure exactly how something's going to go, Prop 15, that has to do with property taxes, that seems very complex. Maybe there's some upsides, maybe there's some downsides, but I'll just sort of, if I'm on the fence, I'll default to no. And that is sort of the trend in California. And so maybe it shouldn't be as surprising that given of these 12, I think only 3 have passed. There's still 2 that are up in the air, but so I think it's easy to overstate exactly what the sort of political or ideological ramifications of this are to say that, oh, California must be actually secretly really conservative. I don't think that's the case. But I also think that it's not true to say, oh, the state is as progressive as sometimes Californians and those outside the state like to make it out to be.
Speaker Pérez, what's your broad brush takeaway? I want to talk about some of these ballot measures, dig into them more deeply, but can you take any big takeaways from these results?
No, I don't think you can. I think Ben's absolutely right that California is much more nuanced than people believe it is. And the reality is the side of the campaign that has more money has certain advantage, but there's always an advantage for the no side. Sometimes we get a little too into our own heads and think that a title and summary reads one way to the people that drafted it, when in fact it reads somewhat differently to the voters. And I think the classic example of that is Prop 25. I think the folks who were fighting around title and summary expected there would be a very easy understanding of what it would mean to do away with money bail. I think when you can contrast that with how folks voted on Prop 20, I think it reinforces that there was some confusion about what was at issue. And quite frankly, when you look at the argument that there's a constitutional protection for certain elements, people get a little leery about making change. And when they're unsure, they do gravitate towards the no side. I think the thing that's a little more interesting for me to look at is over time, what the geographic shift on some of these questions are. And so we've historically, folks thought of California as north-south. Then we had a more nuanced view of east-west, inland, coastal. But I think you're seeing other patterns develop. Alpine County really stands out for me this year. It was on the progressive end of every single question. Ben referenced Prop 23. Alpine County was the one vote, the one county in the state that Prop 23 passed in. I'm old school. I like to look at San Benito County, which has historically been the bellwether county for the state, and it proved to be a bellwether county again this time. But I don't think there are easy ideological conclusions to jump to based on these propositions this year.
Alpine, I want to get back to that because I had the same reaction and I'm like, what is happening? Did somebody move, did 6 people move to Alpine that didn't live? It's a tiny county. Controller Yee, I do want you to weigh in on this broader question and I'll throw in the kind of added, purpleness of some places like Orange County, right? Which Democrats had a big wins in 2018, much more mixed results now.
Yeah.
are we, I mean, you're from San Francisco. It's not a state of San Francisco. I mean,
No, no, it's not. No, I think what we saw, and I don't think what, what can't be discounted also is just, the time that we saw this election take place, right? So, we're at the convergence of so many things happening at once. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, the recession, and I mean, every part of the state hit by wildfires, the impacts of climate change, and then this growing outcry for racial equity and justice. And so you put all of that together, there's a lot of stress on people right now. And so, and I think when there was a lot of stress, the tendency is not to, try to support change, and certainly change that's not easily understandable. So the default to no is definitely, kind of in play there. But I would say, in terms of what happened in Orange County, obviously we saw victories. Orange turned blue, became the new blue in 2018 with the congressional seats. And I think, what was surprising to me, frankly, in Orange County is that the Republican candidates who won look to be winning these congressional seats, two of them anyway, are candidates who really are kind of the antithesis of what it means to be responsible during this COVID-19 pandemic. And so, why that issue did not speak more loudly, I'm still kind of scratching my head over, since we're living with that every single day. But I do think that, there's always this kind of this moderation where when there's a lot happening and people are feeling stress, and certainly economic stress, that you're probably not going to see, kind of support for pretty progressive changes.
let me stick with you on that, because Prop 15 is something that, folks on the Democratic side of the aisle have been really wanting to tackle for a long time. And it does seem like the fact that we're in a pandemic or recession may have made it easier for business to argue that this is not the time to raise taxes on business. On the other hand, this is gonna, this could have really helped the state budget significantly.
Absolutely, yes.
I'm curious, just looking at that one, where do you think proponents either went wrong or didn't do enough, or is it just the sort of bad timing?
Well, I will say anything related to Prop 13 is always kind of the third rail. I think the opponents did a great job of really elevating the threat to homeowners and what it would do for residential property taxes, even though it had nothing to do with increasing residential property taxes. In fact, it had all these protections around residential property taxes, including those who are owners of multifamily housing. So I don't know how you can get more foolproof than that with respect to protecting homeowners, but the opponents took advantage of it. I mean, Prop 13, every time you talk about that, it brings you right back to 1978 in terms of what that revolt was about. And it was about, seniors being taxed out of their homes. And I think that message really came home to roost again today, this time.
All right, Speaker Pérez. Yeah, I actually, go ahead, and then I have a follow-up for you too.
Sure. I think the controller is absolutely right. I think there's another element. With so many businesses being shuttered because of the impacts of the pandemic, the argument that big business would pass on the tax increase to small business really scared people more than it would in other settings. And so I think that's another element to this, but the controller's right. Even if you look at the primary, when Prop 13 was about something very different in the primary, the fact that it even had the same number
Right.
people react in very visceral ways.
It was a school bond measure, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Speaker, let's drill in on one thing, which is I was really shocked to see, looking at the map of Prop 15. So we saw, not surprisingly, support in San Francisco, Alameda, LA, but also in Humboldt, Alpine, Imperial counties. And yet it lost in places like San Diego, Orange County, Sacramento. Is there anything you can kind of draw from that?
Again, I think there's probably a higher concentration in some of the counties in which it failed of small businesses that are feeling very different impacts about the COVID required shutdowns. And it makes people more worried about, just as I'm trying to bounce back when I finally get to reopen my business, can I afford with the boogeyman effect that the opponents tried to put out there. I'm not saying that they were correct to make that calculation, but it was a rational, reasonable response to a limited sets of information and high concentration of fear mongering.
I mean, Ben, this was close. Like, it wasn't a blowout. So
Not at all.
Where do you think? I mean, maybe I should ask them, but where do you
I'll
think?
tell you what the solution is.
Yeah, are you guys going to come back at this?
Well, look, I think you have to. And I think you have to go a step further with respect to reinforcing the benefits to individual homeowners.
Yeah.
We know since 1978, there's been a huge proportional shift of tax obligation on individual homeowners. Every time there's been a ballot initiative that extends homeowner protections to new groups of folks to be able to avail themselves of Prop 13 protection, those tend to be received well. So I think you have to pair the next effort not only with closing the loopholes, but expanding the protections for individual family homeowners that bought their homes at times where they couldn't benefit from some of the Prop 13 benefits. So you got to give people a little more of a benefit at the same time as you're closing the loophole.
And that was true in Prop 19, right, John? So, right.
Yeah, I was about to say that Prop 19 is a good example of that. I mean, Ben, can you talk a little bit about what the impacts of this are going to be short term on the state budget and just what we might be seeing? Because there was, I think there's been hopes around this, around a stimulus package. Where are we at in Sacramento, Ben Christopher?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the controller could also speak to this probably better than I could, but certainly, Prop 15 in particular, it wouldn't have gone into effect until at least 2022, then rolled in other circumstances in 2023. So I don't think there would be necessarily a direct budgetary impact, but I do think politically, this is probably going to ramp up calls, particularly from the left, for more of a more aggressive solution in the meantime, because certainly, in the last few months, we've seen all these headlines about sort of the economic or the budgetary wreckage that is being left by this recession, but it's really going to start hitting next year, I think, when we're going into the full budgetary year. And on top of that, I wouldn't be surprised if, most of us assumed that Joe Biden was going to win based on the polls, and perhaps there was some hope out of Sacramento that would also come with a Democratic-controlled Senate, which I think would make the prospect of additional stimulus funding for California a little bit rosier. And now that, again, we don't know what's going to happen in Georgia, but if there is Republicans maintain control of the U.S. Senate, there may be even less of an incentive for someone like Senator McConnell to sort of work with a Biden administration to give additional funding to blue states like California. So that's going to be another sort of challenge going forward, I imagine.
Yeah.
I want to put both of you on this. Controller, you've both been involved in politics since the last recession and the deep cuts we made. Is the state approaching this any differently? Because a lot of the social safety nets we, cut 10 plus years ago haven't even all been restored.
Right, I know. So, I mean, I'm looking at Mr. Speaker here, and I mean, he was a part of all of that. And fast forward to today, I mean, we entered this time prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic reduced recession actually on much more solid footing than we did back in 2008. So, historic budget reserves, fully funded rainy day fund, and so the governor and the legislature had a lot to work with, and they did really resort to those funds for balancing the budget. The irony here is that, and maybe it's not an irony, it's what we've already known, and that is revenues today are coming in above budget projections. And much of that is through the personal income tax. But in some ways, that just affirms the fact that those who are doing well are continuing to do well. And what the pandemic and the recession really unveiled was that those who are vulnerable are definitely not doing well, and so it stands to reason that our revenues are up at this point in time. And so, does that present kind of a false sense of security for the legislature going forward, that we actually are on better footing than we really are? So that's really the question, I think, going forward.
And look, I've talked to the legislative leaders, I've talked to budget leaders. I don't think there's a false sense of security, but they are being very smart about availing themselves of the tools. When my colleagues and I dealt with the last, with the Great Recession, we wanted to make sure we didn't replicate the problems going forward. We created the rainy day fund that I authored that the controller made reference to. That really accounts for roughly a third of the budgetary solutions that are going to be necessary over the next 3 years. What I think the governor and the legislature have been smart about is saying this is not a one-year hit, and it can't be a one-year set of solutions. We have to approach this over multiple years, draw down the revenues where they are, really be smart about looking at sustainable revenues that come in versus spiking revenues. And much of what we're seeing in the $9 billion above projection are spiking revenues. They're not predictable revenues.
Right.
The controller's absolutely right. It speaks to the vast difference of realities of different sectors of our population and why it's so important to make sure that we take care of the most vulnerable people that are really on the edge of absolute dire poverty that is impossible to come back from. And so I'm optimistic that the governor and the legislative leaders will continue to be thoughtful on this question. But this is going to take us several years to dig out of this hole.
Well, I mean, you've hit on some of it, the rainy day fund, the kind of being a little bit not thinking just about this year, but trying to project forward. But are there other lessons? Because to your point, I mean, yes, we know that people on CalWORKs, people who are, relying on our social safety nets are the most vulnerable. They've also been hit hardest by COVID. But as you well know, the state budget's like pretty set. Like there's only a little bit, like there's not a lot of discretionary money when it comes, and education, I mean, schools aren't open. My kids, I think you saw one of them grabbing a plug because he's 7 and now he knows how to use a Chromebook because, the only good part of this. But like, what are the lessons or what are the options really given this situation? I mean, this is a panel looking at this through an equity lens.
Yeah. So a couple of things, Marisa. I think, well, first off, we can't let up in terms of additional federal relief. All notwithstanding how difficult it still could be with the Senate if it doesn't come into majority Democratic hands. So we don't let up on federal relief. We want to continue to be sure that we're investing in the most vulnerable among us. But there are going to be conversations, and were conversations before the legislature adjourned this last session around new revenue proposals. And, and those are going to be tough because we want to be sure that we are looking at this, to your point, through an equity lens. And I'm sure we're going to talk about Prop 16 momentarily, but I think at this point, everything that we do is probably going to need to, because of what we're facing with the pandemic, with the recession, has got to carry that economic and racial justice and equity lens. And so these are the kinds of decisions that the legislature is going to have to grapple with. And I will say, from my perspective, being in state government, there also is much more that state government can do to change up our business of how we govern. And we still are a government that isn't caught up in the 21st century. And in terms of how we provide for the needs of Californians, I think there are definitely more efficiencies and ways to save money to do it.
And at the risk of sounding Pollyanna, I'm actually optimistic that the federal government response, even with a divided government, will be stronger than it was coming into this point for a couple of reasons. One, you're immediately post-election instead of pre-election, so that changes certain realities. Even if there continues to be Republican control of the Senate, McConnell and Biden have proven to be able to work out deals from time to time. Speaker Pelosi has been brilliant at navigating a lot of these questions. And when we look at the challenges going forward, you also have to look at the changing dynamics of what parts of our country are being impacted by the highest increases of COVID exposure and what that means economically there. And the reality is, well, COVID started to most impact highly concentrated urban centers. Now the pandemic has moved into rural and exurban areas in ways that really change the political lens for the discussion of federal response.
I want to talk about some other ballot measures, but I do have an audience question that I think would fit in here, which is sort of to my first question, the difference in voting patterns between 2018 and 2020, and whether you all see any of these votes, whether it be California or nationally, as like a checks and balances, like people splitting the ticket because they want a divided government. Speaker?
So look, I think people love to talk about divided government as the imperative for voters. I don't think that's the case. The question is which campaigns were able to inspire which responses. And so Orange County is a perfect place to look at. You could look at Harley Ruda losing his congressional seat. He's conceded. This is not me calling the race for him. You could look at assembly races that folks thought would turn Democratic that didn't, and at the same time, state Senate seats that did turn Democratic, right? And so how you campaign matters. How you connect with individual voters matter. And so if you're a voter trying to calculate divided government, yeah, you may vote for a congressional race differently than your presidential race, but that doesn't explain why you're seeing different results in overlying or neighboring assembly and Senate districts. How you campaign does matter. How candidates can connect with voters matter. each of the candidates who did well in 18 outperformed what their 18 numbers in 20. The question is, who else turned out to vote? There were spiking turnouts in Orange County as there were other places. So it's much more complicated than people just liking a divided government.
I mean, but Ben, doesn't this also just speak to good candidates versus not as strong candidates?
But good campaigns, not just good candidates.
True.
Yeah.
I mean, Ben, what do you think? Because I just was on the phone with the heads of both the Republican and Democratic parties looking at the Orange County results, and the speaker's absolutely right. I mean, it's such a mixed bag. It really does seem like that's now a purple county, right? This is a battleground county.
Right.
But I mean, Ben, what are your thoughts on, like, okay, so for example, Harley Ruda underperformed Biden and Michelle Steele overperformed Trump. So this wasn't just about the president, was it?
Right. Well, so I think a couple things. I mean, talking about sort of the strength of the candidates. In that case, Harley Ruda won as a sort of outsider who didn't have much political experience. So I think anyone who is sort of dissatisfied with the current government, the president and Congress, was able to sort of project their own feelings on, or their own ideology onto him. And also he was running against Dana Rohrabacher, who was sort of a uniquely flawed candidate, I think you could say. Whereas this year it was sort of the inverse, whereas Ruda had more of sort of a record that he was having to defend. And Michelle Steele, although she obviously is a well-known entity in Orange County, but it was sort of a different dynamic. But it's interesting. I was actually just, I'm working on a story about this just now, looking at sort of the precinct by precinct results that we're seeing out of that district. And in fact, most precincts are sort of ideologically consistent, where you have sort of precincts that go overwhelmingly for Trump and Michelle Steele, and then you have another set that are going overwhelmingly for Biden and Harley Ruda. But you do have about 1 in 10 we're splitting between Steele and Biden. So I don't know if that's a case of ticket splitting or some people just sort of not filling out certain portions of the ballot and being a little bit more selective about it. And I don't know if it's necessarily that people are going through the explicit thought process of, oh, I think it would be better to have a mixed government where, Republicans control this or Democrats control that. It might just be sort of how voters are being primed, in a sense that in 2018, it was really all about Trump. And sort of, even if you're a little bit more conservative, you just wanted to sort of respond to the president and your dislike of the president. Whereas this,
you have a check, right? Like
a check, and maybe not explicitly in terms of, okay, I want this person to win so that they can provide a policy check, but just sort of internally about the way you're sort of, what is leading you to make your decision. Whereas this year, maybe a lot of people were thinking, well, Biden's going to be the president, and I can sort of retreat to my sort of core ideological convictions, which might be more consistent with a conservative candidate. Again, this is all kind of speculation because we're still a week out and we haven't looked at sort of the really more granular data, but it does seem like that. There's at least a little bit of that going on. And because these races are so close, a little shift can have a big impact.
So if I may, I was in Orange County for 15 years, running a union before I was in the legislature, and have seen a lot of evolution in Orange County. There are a lot of voters who really are torn on how they view several of these questions. So it's how a candidate speaks to them and whether they can speak to a voter who's not as ideologically strident as they were thought to have been. Now, in 18, those voters only had one way to express their dislike of Trump. That was in these congressional races. In 20, they had multiple ways to express their dislike. And the first one was directly voting on the presidential campaign. And as you look at the clusters of blue and red votes in Orange County, they don't look like Orange County has historically. And so, again, it's candidates, but it's also campaigns, and how effectively different campaigns operated, how folks engaged in an election where you couldn't do the same kind of door-to-door contact that you could in the past, who figured out how to manage that better than who else.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting looking at Orange County because you see these red, along the coast in more affluent communities is really where Trump got more support, and the more changing demographics, the more working class areas are where we're seeing Democrats making these inroads, which is sort of the flip of what we've been talking about since 2016, that, educated, wealthier white people are voting for Dem. I mean, it's,
So Marisa, can I add something? I think certainly the elevated numbers of who voted, I think is going to be very interesting as well. So, I mean, I can just say within the API community, I think we're going to see a pretty mixed bag in terms of, where they landed relative to, voting Democrat, Republican, and also among the Latino community. And it goes down, and I agree with the speaker. It's the message, what's the campaign, actually offering to people? And I think we're going to see some interesting, outcomes of that, because, and some of it might be generational, some of it just, might be just where geographic, in terms of, what's top of mind for them geographically where they live. So the lessons learned are going to be just so plentiful here, and it's going to take a while, I think, just to unpack all of it.
I know,
I
we
think
want
one
to
of
like
the
tie it up in a bow, and it's not that easy. Sorry, speaker.
I was just going to say one of the lessons is each of the subpopulations of voters we talk about is much more nuanced than anybody ever wants to think it is.
That's right.
So this year there's been, discussion about whether there were spiking numbers of Latinos or African American men voting for Trump, and the numbers were a little different than they were 4 years ago. But when you look at base level turnout and where it was, there was some amplification of outliers. The same thing as the controller said. You look at the API community, a great place to look is around Garden Grove. You saw numbers that look very different in Garden Grove than they may have looked in other communities. And there's a whole lot to unpack there. And I think in some ways, when you look at Garden Grove, in some ways, when you look across the country in Miami, some of it is a reaction to lived experiences of folks and how that impacts how they perceive certain messages that the Trump administration was putting out with respect to socialism, with respect to a bunch of other issues. So lived experience for voters and that kind of memory that people have does have an impact on how they perceive these messages and how they act on these messages.
So do you guys think, this is a really broad question, and I do want to dig in on 16 and 22 in a minute, but Controller, do you think that the Republicans were successful in painting, with the socialist brush, with the defund the police, in hurting some of these, congressional candidates or even lower down the ticket candidates that are Democrats?
Mm-hmm.
And do Democrats need to figure out a different message to respond to that?
Well, I think in all of this, language matters, right? And so, in terms of what the particular issue is, how you translate that to voters really matters. What I think the Republicans took advantage of, from Trump all the way down, is this whole notion of law and order. And, we saw it, and it resonated with so many people. And when people are feeling vulnerable, and their sense of economic security has gone by the wayside, and this is what's before them as a decision at the ballot. I think they really start to think about this is not the time to be thinking about widespread change. So it's this is just such an interesting experiment in time in terms of what we're up against, given this point in time and just all the issues that are hitting voters. But I think at the end of the day, I think still with every election, what it means for people's pocketbook, what it means for their sense of security, still resonates at the end of the day.
All right, well, speaking of messaging, let's talk about Prop 16. This would have eliminated Prop 209, which was the ban on affirmative action in government. The UC obviously was a big focus of both 209 and Prop 16 campaign, and I know the Regents, with you leading them, Speaker Pérez, did endorse this measure. What happened? This was put on the ballot by the legislature in the wake of the George Floyd killing. There was all this energy behind Black Lives Matter. And not to put words in your mouth, but it doesn't seem like voters made that same connection that the lawmakers did when they voted to put it on the ballot.
We all know that these are intertwined questions, but it's harder as you're looking at that ballot as an individual voter to draw all those conclusions in the same way. And so I think Californians fundamentally want fairness. But it was easier to articulate a simple message against Prop 16 than it was to articulate an easy message for Prop 16. And, one of the challenges was there wasn't the traditional ramp up for the campaign for Prop 16 than you normally have. There was a moment of opportunity to get it passed by both houses by 2/3 votes, and everybody went running quickly. And the campaign did a really great job, but they didn't have enough time to keep landing the message and build the message, one. Two, again, I think it was hurt by the fact that you couldn't have the same person-to-person communication, to allay people's fears, to express to people, look, this isn't doing quotas. This isn't eliminating opportunities for your kids. This is just making sure that along with all the 14 other criteria that a university could look at, we could look at this question, that it could also speak to gender-based access in so many different areas. And I really do think there wasn't enough focus on the gender impacts of Prop 16. I think if there had been more discussion about that, it would have put us in a different spot. But let's be clear. This past year, the University of California admitted its most diverse group of students as freshmen in the history of the university. Berkeley admitted the most African-American students since 1989. We're making progress. It's not fast enough, and we've made progress without the benefit of 209. We're going to go and continue to make that progress going forward, but we're going to have this conversation again and continue to do the hard work of explaining to people all that is involved with creating the benefits that Prop 16 would have created.
And Controller, where do things go from here? And is there a way that you think could make this more palpable? And to the speaker's point, I mean, I think what he just said might be some reason that some folks on the left voted against it, that they don't necessarily think it's necessary because we have done a good job in California of increasing access and equity.
Yeah, well,
Progress, but not enough.
exactly. No, what I will say about Prop 16, which had we had the time to ramp up, as the speaker said, I think we could have told this story. And that is, I thought the whole history was lost about how we even got to this place in the first place. That, the idea that we are lifting a constitutional ban on affirmative action comes from somewhere. And that is, we're trying to root out centuries old systemic racism and sexism. So, and to not be able to tell that story is, our day of reckoning with respect to, all of that is going to have to come going forward with every policy issue that we take up. I mean, to what the speaker said in terms of university admissions, I mean, that's like one area where that's going to continue to be front and center in terms of how we keep our campuses diverse. When we talk about housing, when we talk about how to build resilience in low-income communities, for climate change. I mean, this is where I think every policy front and every action that we take now is going to have that at its core. I just look at my own API community and such division within the API community over this issue, right? Everyone in my community was focused on college admissions, and I was a strong proponent of Prop 16, and where I countered was this: why are we creating a ceiling for ourselves that college admissions is the end all be all? We don't have university presidents that are API. We don't have heads of our public medical schools that are API. I'm a public employer. I can't even have people who look like us. Consider them as one of the factors in terms of how I hire. And so when we look at these opportunities, I think there's just really a misunderstanding about what this means. The questions that were raised by the opponents were threatening enough to where I think people just decided that this wasn't a time for a change. But the interesting part was there were young people who actually voted against it, who felt that instead of lifting this ban on affirmative action, they wanted more immediate relief. So look at, putting grants out there to help communities, look at, but really kind of ignoring that this has been kind of a systemic issue that we're trying to address. And it's just like one, it's not even the full remedy. I mean, we're just like, trying to just say, we want people of color, we want women just to be in the mix. And so this is it's just like a lot going on among all demographics, but I think it was just too much to really ask if the voters were going to feel secure about lifting that ban once and for all.
Can I jump in there? Just add one thing. I mean,
yeah. I was going to ask if you had any broader thoughts on this.
Well, I just, when Controller Yi was talking about the sort of lack of historical context, one thing that strikes me, and this might not be fully true, it's maybe just anecdotal, but I certainly spoke to some voters, including some in my family who are a little bit younger, who grew up at a time post sort of the ban on affirmative action in California, who didn't really have that experience sort of understanding what it meant in practice, what affirmative action means in practice. And so I think there was a lot of just lacking that sort of that understanding. I heard some people saying, well, maybe I don't understand this, but basically this is the state legalizing racism. It's legalizing the ability to take race into account. That sounds like racism to me. And certainly opponents of Proposition 16 would say, yes, that's exactly right. But I'm sure that proponents of 16 would have liked to have engaged in that discussion a little bit more, because I think there was just a sort of a lack of context for a lot of, especially younger voters.
This is inherently the problem with the initiative process, right? It's one of the three great reforms of the progressive era, but it's the one that I think has had the least beneficial impact on the state. We take broad concepts that are very complicated and we make them a binary question, yes or no. And we make it complicated to ever then amend them when we learn about the underlying problems that they bring with them. You know, I think we'd be better off without it. The voters obviously disagree with me. The voters have voted to protect the initiative process, but at the same time are very frustrated by the initiative process because we're taking very complicated issues and dumping them in the voters' laps without all the information that's always necessary to make these evaluations.
I mean, Ben, on that point, I often get this question when I do pre-election panels, like, why am I having to weigh in on this? And I agree on dialysis. Why am I having
Oh my God, yeah.
Okay, but several measures here we had to weigh in on because in the case of Prop 25, the bail industry went to the ballot to overturn, you know, a duly elected legislative law in the form of referendum. And this is my segue to Prop 22, which we might spend the rest of the time on because it's so big. You know, the gig companies spent $200 million to overturn the will of the legislature. The
will of the legislature and the thinking of the courts, because AB 5 that the legislature passed was as a result of the Dynamex decision of the courts, where the Supreme Court then asked the legislature to continue to dig into this question. So this was the gig companies not only trying to undo what the legislature passed, but the direction that the Supreme Court had established. So
this is like small potatoes, but I found it really interesting. And Ben, I'll go to you on this because I know you're a map dork like me. Okay, so looking at the only places that Prop 22 failed were the Bay Area and like up to Humboldt. I don't know, like the North Coast might be becoming more like the Bay Area. I don't know, but does that, and I know we don't know yet, we're just speculate wildly, but I mean, do you think that's because we're the home of Silicon Valley here and people are more skeptical of these companies? Do you think it could have been a messaging thing? I mean, is there any sense yet as to why? I mean,
if you'll let me just speculate wildly. I mean, I'm sure, you know, in the Bay Area, we're both in the Bay Area, and I do think there is a little bit more of a, if not a distrust, sort of an ambivalence around some of these companies, just because it's sort of caught up with the cost of living and gentrification and these other sort of very high profile concerns that really touch people's lives directly. But also, you know, I mean, Prop 22 became a sort of an issue around which progressive activists really rallied. And so it's also just ideologically consistent that you'd see. I mean, certainly, you know, same with rent control. It's always sort of the Bay Area. It's a little green island in the middle of red in the state, if you're looking at the Secretary of State's maps on these things. So even if Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart, and et cetera, weren't all based here, you might also see that dynamic regardless, just because that's sort of how the ideological divisions sort of carve themselves in this one.
But Marisa, this is also the time where I think lived experiences, I mean, this is, we saw a lot of gig workers and these drivers who were really affected by COVID. And so, and not eligible, by the way, for unemployment benefits. And so, you know, you look at this and you know, people were really feeling the real impacts of, you know, what the economy was not providing for them who worked with these app-based companies.
Look, it was one of the most dishonest campaigns I've ever seen. And the controller's right. Gig workers and independent contractors in general weren't eligible for unemployment. The state took action, was able to correct it in certain places. And then the gig companies basically claimed that they were offering protections in the form of Prop 22 that would have been stronger protections had Prop 22 failed. But with the constant drumbeat of over $200 million, with the fact that every time somebody was afraid to go out and ordered a meal on Postmates, they got a message for Prop 22, when you got your groceries delivered by Instacart because you were trying to limit the exposure you had to other folks. You got a message about Prop 22. So it wasn't just the money that we saw spent on traditional ads. It was the embedded ads for people who are having to use some of these apps to be socially responsible and limit their interaction. It really is, in my opinion, one of the most disingenuous campaigns I've seen, and that's saying something.
Sticking with you for a second, speaker, we have an audience question asking, how does this going to affect gig workers' ability to organize, this proposition?
Well, it's interesting. You know, the CEO of Lyft has said he's now willing to go and talk to union leaders and see if there's a way to organize. But you know, it's going to be very complicated because it's not a traditional NLRB style election. If any of the gig companies want to object, they're going to have a very easy time objecting. So it's only in a rare case if the construct of what the CEO of Lyft is offering is mutually agreeable, which is highly unlikely. So I think it further makes it difficult for these workers to unionize.
Yeah. Betty, I mean, are you concerned that this model could spread to other industries? This is another question, playing off an audience question. Like, I mean, obviously these companies prove that you can probably go buy the labor.
Oh, absolutely. Well, actually, you go back and you look at the deliberations around AB5 and all the industries that, you know, really have high utilization of independent contractors, right? So, you know, sure, that can flip in a heartbeat with any of these types of industries. So, you know, what I would say about this is, you know, you were asking about, can these workers organize? Many of them were already organizing, you know, prior to this. I mean, just not in the traditional sense, but, you know, gig workers rising, and it was a national movement, not just here in California. And, you know, you look at, you know, what's going to come out of this. I probably should just give a little bit of a plug to the Governor's Future of Work Commission, on which I serve as a member, but this is going to be front and center because the charge of the commission is to develop a new social compact with workers, and we mean all workers. So how do you ensure job quality and that, you know, workers have a voice? And so, you know, all of these things are going to be part of how we put together a new social compact with workers. And so, you know, I think this is going to get wrapped up in that to some extent, but I will just say, as a tax administrator, I have to just say this. This is if these workers are not employees of these companies, tax compliance is going to be chaotic and probably non-existent. You know, these are when they were independent contractors, these drivers, they were considered to be self-employed. You know, to all the responsibilities of being a self-employed, you know, person or being in business for yourself takes a lot of support, a lot of infrastructure. The companies weren't exactly facilitating that to happen for their workers, and so from a tax compliance perspective, it's a mess. So you know, and to the speaker's point about this all started with a Dynamex decision, and just weeks before voters were going to vote on this, the appellate court essentially upheld AB5, that these workers are employees of these companies. So, you know, we've been back and forth on this, and it'll be interesting to see what these companies have to offer. But, you know, I think this is all going to get wrapped up in terms of what work looks like generally for all workers in the future.
I mean, Ben, it's true, right? This is a whole new category of worker. I mean, what do we know about what this is going to change for these drivers and what it may not change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, clearly Prop 22 did include these additional sort of protections, if you will. So it wasn't, it is in some ways as if it created this sort of third independent contractor plus, because there were certain slight benefits, not quite a minimum wage, but a minimum pay based on driving time. And so it did create that sort of this third way. But, you know, just sort of going back to sort of trying to understand the political results here, I wonder if one way to think about it is also just thinking about it in terms of the voters' general inclination to preserve the status quo when in doubt. Because I know that AB5 is the law of the land and Dynamex may be the law of the land. But for voters' own sort of sense of how the world operates now, a yes vote kind of preserves that, because it just keeps Uber and Lyft operating basically the way that they have been with these slight little modification. And so in a sense, perhaps maybe that's a way to understand why Californians overwhelmingly supported Prop 22, because the yes vote in this case was actually sort of preserving the status quo, if not in a legal sense, then sort of in the way that people experience the world.
So Ben, you had two different theses there, and only one of them could be true. So one is that it preserves the status quo, and the second is that it was a third way. Again, I'll go back to my previous statement. It was the most disingenuous campaign, with over $200 million of that which they had to report, plus a ton of free advertising, to say the courts and the legislature think you deserve a loaf, and we're willing to give you a quarter of a loaf, maybe if. And it was so good at repeating the lie over and over and over again that it took hold. This is not unlike the campaign strategy of the Trump administration. If you tell the same lie over and over and over again, you're going to get enough people to believe it. This was not, in my opinion, voters going towards the status quo in the way that they usually do. It's that there wasn't a decent balance of arguments out there because they were able to use so much money to do it. And so if you're going to spend $220 million to create this new supposedly well-intentioned set of benefits for your employees, what's your motivation? Clearly the motivation was to transfer all the risk from the company for the obligations that they had under the law and transfer them onto folks that are trying to string together 2 or 3 gig jobs to be able to survive. And, I appreciate the work that's being done about the future of work because it's essential. The dangerous part is if this is the beginning of an ongoing transfer of responsibility to folks who are the most vulnerable.
I mean, Controller Yee, obviously the opposition was just outspent and kind of, outgamed, but I don't know, did opponents do a good enough job? I mean, you mentioned the idea that, folks, gig workers don't qualify for unemployment insurance, that the federal government and the state had to step in.
Right.
I mean, do we have dollar amounts on that? Like, I don't know. I do feel like the message, the Uber Lyft side was very effective at taking drivers and using them and making people think that an overwhelming number of their drivers wanted this, which I don't think is necessarily true, but like some did, some didn't, some wanted both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I heard a lot of people say, I want flexibility and I want to make more. Like,
yeah, look,
I mean,
bottom line is $200 million buys you a lot of good messaging, right? So, and the other thing I would say is that, when you look at who are these drivers, it's not a monolithic demographic, right? And so, how do you create a message around, their experience that actually is going to resonate with people that, that frankly, the companies have had the advantage of doing with their campaign, well-funded campaign. You have drivers who, to the speaker's point, and this is where the government had to step in a big way. These companies are not paying into unemployment. And so the state stepped in terms of relief for them when they lost their jobs. These are gig workers, drivers working 2, 3, 4 jobs just to make ends meet. You have others who are doing this as a second job to supplement income. You have, excuse me, you have retirees that are driving. So, your demographic is kind of like all over the map, right? And so, and I think this is one where I do think, the lived experience about what this means to people in their pocketbook probably resonated, depending on what this meant in terms of being, working in this space with these app-based companies.
All right, we just have a few more minutes before our final question. Ben Christopher, I want to go to you on one thing, which is Prop 21 rent control failed again. It was put on the ballot by a very controversial man, Michael Weinstein, in Los Angeles. And this is the second time in several years that voters have rejected this. We saw people who, have historically been more open to this kind of thing, including the governor, come out against it. Is this just like, should we take away from this that California doesn't want to expand rent control? They don't want to overturn Costa-Hawkins? Or is it like everything we're talking about more complicated because of the players and the moment we're in?
It's a great question. I mean, certainly the fact that this version of Costa-Hawkins repeal did allow for a 15-year phase-in, which I think really was included to sort of address the concern about the initial proposal from 2018 Prop 10, which was that it would restrict or stymie new supply, which of course is a big concern in a state with a giant housing shortage. That was included, and it doesn't seem like that really paid off in the sense that the margins aren't that much better. And so it's hard for me to see how they're going to be able to change this to make it more politically palatable, particularly this year, given, I mean, again, not to be a broken record about this, but I know that voters are probably very hesitant to do anything making any very large structural changes. And again, there was a lot of spending on the other side of this to suggest that this could really exacerbate the housing crisis, or that it could redound to the sort of the detriment of a lot of renters in some way. You know, so there may be, again, just a hesitancy, particularly in this time of great economic uncertainty, to make any of these big changes. But one would think, given where people are across the state economically, that there would be more appetite for something like rent control. We just didn't see it. So again, we're still counting the votes. But if I were on the yes side of this, I wouldn't be too optimistic.
All right, we are going to do a lightning round of final thoughts now, a minute or two each. But I'll stick with you, Ben. I mean, coming out of this, I know some of these races haven't been called, but I think we have a pretty good sense. What are you going to be looking for, particularly in Sacramento, over the next couple of months, given the dynamics of both our ballot and a changing Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, looking at sort of the legislative races, it doesn't look like there's going to be that much change in sort of the dynamic there. So again, I think just seeing how the legislature picks up where it left off last year in terms of dealing with COVID, dealing with a much more constrained budgetary environment, and seeing sort of what capacity is going to be left to deal with some of the very large other pressing issues that I think were put on hold last year because of the constrained calendar and the constrained budget, to see if there's going to be any more appetite to deal with things like housing and homelessness and healthcare and environmental issues and so forth. So I'll just be looking for that starting next month.
All right, Speaker Pérez, broadly, but also as regent of the UC, what are you what's on your to-do list, and what are you going to be watching politically?
So, you know, from the UC perspective, on my to-do list is making sure that as money becomes available, that we get our fair share so that we can continue expanding access everywhere throughout the state. We know that there's a huge multiplier effect, that where UC is only second to the Cal State system as being the tool that helps move people from poverty into the upper echelons of economic opportunity. So the idea of fighting for increased funding for higher education broadly is front and center. Managing how we repopulate campuses so that students can have a hybrid process that moves us back to normalcy is really important. We've done
we made it this long without a freeze. I think that was pretty good. I'll give him
incredibly low rates of infection. So working on those questions is key. For the state, I think the legislature does have to do what Ben says, which is pick up where they left off. Housing and homelessness and how we deal with healthcare have to be front and center. We've continued to work on climate change, but we haven't made the same kind of progress on housing and homelessness. And you know, when you look at the impacts of COVID, these are also connected housing issues and healthcare issues. We have a lot more work to do in health equity. The disease has shown us what we always knew about inequity and access to healthcare and what the differences are in outcomes. Look, I got diagnosed with COVID just over 2 months ago. I recovered incredibly quickly. One, because I didn't have a very strong strain, but two, because I had access to isolation and to doctors that other folks didn't, which then got me into a clinical trial that the average person doesn't. But my ability to isolate so that I didn't expose other people is not the norm for the average Californian. And we ought to be looking at all of the possible interventions we can do in those areas as well.
Controller Yee, the last word is to you. What are you going to be working on, and what are you hoping to see the state tackle besides a reboot of Prop 15?
Well, I agree with both what Ben and the speaker said, but also, you know, we do have an opportunity with, you know, a new administration in Washington. And I think certainly an administration that's more aligned with the values of California. In my arena, I mean, I would love to see in the tax arena just many more incentives coming to California so that we can actually look at rebuilding our economy with new sectors being prominent, particularly in the renewable energy space. And then hopefully re-engaging in a dialogue about the Trump tax cuts and having a renewed conversation about the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction.
All right, State Controller Betty Yee, Speaker John Pérez, and Cal Matters Ben Christopher, I really appreciate all of your time and attention and thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions.
Yeah.
And to UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, thank you so much for having us. I thought this was a really fun event, and hopefully one we can do in person next time.
Here, here.
All right.
All right, have a